everyone, welcome to the Data Journalism panel. Thanks for joining us. I'm the moderator today. My name is Chen Yanjia, and I'm assistant professor at Northeastern University, both journalism and computer science. So today we have three amazing presentations about data journalism. We have amazing presenters Laurie Glenn Kay here, Jiangxi, and also Lily Houtman here. So each presentation will be 10 to 15 minutes, and we do have a Q&A session at the very end. So once each presenter finishes presentation, I'll invite the three of you back to the stage, and then we can do a Q&A session, okay? And I also keep track of time, so I'll let you know when you have only like 5 minutes left. Okay, so our first presenter will be Laurie Glenn Kay. He's presenting CuratedDDS, a taxonomy and a dataset of data-driven stories to support journalist inspiration. Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Louis Combin. Until recently, I was a student at École Polytechnique de Montréal, where me and my supervisor co-wrote this article. So, CuratedDDS, a taxonomy and a dataset of data-driven stories to support journalists' inspirations. So, just quick thing, when I use the acronym DDS or data-driven stories, we are speaking data journalism, but with a focus on visualization intensive project or interactive intensive projects. So one of my favorite examples, this was a New York Times article with the past and proposed and past budgets of the White House in 2022. So it's entirely articulated around the visualization, it's interactive, it changes when you scroll, and it's awesome. And those have a lot of benefits for getting and keeping the attention of the audiences, for providing data in a rather efficient manner, but they also are very intensive in terms of work to make them. And so our project was a case study with two teams of DDS producers based in Quebec, so Le Devoir and Radio-Canada. And we worked with initial discussions about their needs and how they work on their DDS projects. We developed a set of tools and organized a 2-week testing session with these DDS producers, which led to feedback interviews to see how we had impacted their work. And the concept behind CuratedDDS is quickly our partners identified a bottleneck task, which was ideation, searching for and finding ideas for DDS project. And we also quickly found a main resource to improve ideation, which is examples, projects from other media outlets that are similar to the things they're doing at that point, and that they use as references for their own work. So this led us to two questions. Can we facilitate creative ideation by improving access to DDS examples? Can we help our partners by giving them access to more examples so that they have an easier time finding ideas? And then how do we improve that access to examples? The solution we offer has two components. First, a taxonomy of data-driven stories, something that allows to describe what the users need so that we can target the relevant examples. Then a dataset of examples to an example we can give them. And finally, an interface, something that makes the taxonomy and the dataset more practical to use. So, for the taxonomy, the truth is, in the literature there are already 11 of them published between 2010 and 2023, which makes a total of 155 dimensions. And so we selected some of those dimensions that were relevant specifically to DDSs, and that had categories so that we can use them as filters later on. This left us with 25, which we were used by merging those that were very similar into 22, and then we structured everything by grouping them into bigger categories, which led to this. So to the left, the great categories, metadata, what do we know, the title, publication date, then everything that's content, data, what do we know about narrative, this kind of thing, with the dimensions and the specific values that they can take, which we will later use to filter the dataset. For the dataset itself, which is probably most interesting, we have found a list of media that had published yearly best-of their works. So things like, the year 2022 in graphics, or 2018, or best data visualizations, and so on. This left us with 55 best-of projects in between 2014 and 2022. And that's a total of nearly 3,000 examples, which was not feasible to annotate by hand within a reasonable timeline. So we chose to select the most recent ones to have the most recent projects and probably the most interesting ones. This left us 884 examples from 13 best-ofs and 6 media outlets. We annotated them by with the taxonomy. We took one line in a table for each of them. Columns was the values of the taxonomy, and we set the values to annotate. This is completed by the interface. It's a simple tool, a table, so with all of the information we have, and then the filters at the top based on the taxonomy. And so our users tested all of these things for 2 weeks, and feedback when they were in contact with the taxonomy, it did allow them to describe what they wanted, what they were going for, a little bit better. And in particular, we spotted something. They favored very broad criteria when they were filtering the dataset. They went for the date, they went for the media outlet, they were for the general topic. And then they were reading the elements of the taxonomy for more specific things. So specific narrative patterns, specific types of visualization, specific form of data. And so 2 different uses, and one of the things, we spotted a vocabulary mismatch between academia and practitioners. We had journalists, and when they came into contact with the taxonomy, they said, oh, this is interesting, I see what that word means, but I never came into contact with it before. That word was present everywhere in the literature we had found, except that our journalists never had been in contact with the academic literature, at least a big section of it. So, and they knew this concept from their practical experience or talking with co-workers, but never from academia. So there's stuff that never moved from one field to the other. Then, for the dataset feedback, well, good news, we had some internal diversity. If you want specific visualization, specific data, we had it somewhere. It was relevant, and the users were satisfied to find outlets that they knew and trusted. They also saw familiar sources, but they had new findings. One of the participants said, I read the New York Times every day because, well, I'm searching for inspiration. And here there was an example from the New York Times that had been published several weeks ago that they had never seen. So they found new stuff by going into this dataset. And one thing they pointed was the need for more cultural diversity. Our media sources were all US-centric. Our participants were not from the US, so that caused some degree of clashes. And lastly, well, they pointed that they did not have access to all our sources. One participant removed themselves from the project because they could not access, they did not have the they did not have the accesses to the newspapers we were using, or to not all, to only a few of them. So they did not have a good experience because they were searching for examples but didn't have access to every newspaper. Lastly, well, interface feedback and overall effects. For the overall effects, we did have an improved speed search and diversity of findings. And we had users that were reported having ideas they would not have had otherwise. On the other hand, there was a pretty steep learning curve for the tool, and what they pointed out was, for most participants, the most beneficial thing was having access to a corpus of DDSs that had been curated, that had been concentrated from several origins into one point, and that had been organized to the same things. So this study has its limitations. We were a case study on a small subset of practitioners, 6 people, all from the same geographic area. We were dependent on the personal subscriptions of the users. And the dataset is aging and the annotation is slow, so it's not easy to fit the dataset with more recent contents, which is also the big future research thing. If we want to make this type of dataset, we need a way to fit them. So it might be automation, it might be crowdsourcing, but that would be the thing. And so for the key takeaways, well, improving access to example does help the ideation process. So we can help data journalists work on DDS projects by helping them find examples. And this can be done by concentrating works from multiple media sources into a singular corpus and organizing them with a common model to help explore this corpus. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laurie, for the great presentation. Very interesting project. Our next presenter will be Dianshi Wangdua, who will be presenting what does it take to create a award-winning data public good, behind the scenes of producing the Atlas of Sustainable Development Goals 2023. Take it away.
Thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Divyanshi Wadhwa. I'm a data scientist at the World Bank. Before I jump into this project, I'll probably answer a very obvious question of why there's a data scientist from the World Bank at a computational journalism conference. Basically, a lot of what the bank does is, of course, we provide loans to developing countries to, measure progress and so on. What we also do is we produce a lot of data to measure development outcomes. It looks like I'm already on Zoom mode, but I can't press next. Do you know what that might be? Oh, I think that works. Alright. There's way too many slides, I won't get through all of them, but hopefully we'll get through some. So what we also do within my team, which is the data group within the World Bank, we collect statistics using surveys, we disseminate data. Some of you or more of you have maybe used World Bank data. We produce data on poverty, GDP, population, etc. The kind of work that we do is to make sure there's a global public good so that everybody can use it, from policymakers and researchers to journalists and to general society. Where does the data come from? There's a bunch of resources here. Hopefully I can share these slides with you so you can take a look. There's an open data platform, which is data.worldbank.org. It's very straightforward, and you can find some of the key development statistics there. And we use this for the atlas that I will be showing in a few minutes. It's based on the World Development Indicators database. That's one of the things that I manage. I focus on gender statistics there. And it basically covers about 1,400 time series data. So again, from population to gender estimates to climate change and so on. And it's pretty widely used. It covers from 1970 to today and covers over 200 countries. So but it's kind of what we use to showcase in our atlas, which I will be talking about. We have other topic-specific data dashboards as well. So if you're looking for information that's specific to gender or poverty or energy, you can go to these dashboards and you can find more information in a more sort of specific and easier way. And if you're looking for microdata, there's also the microdata library, where you basically can find survey data, so very granular data. If you've heard of demographic and health surveys and so on, that's the kind of information that's available there. So the inspiration behind the atlas is one research paper that we did within the bank. I wasn't involved in it. It was from 2014. I wasn't at the bank at that time. And we found out that a third of World Bank reports are never downloaded. Now, that doesn't mean that they're never used. There's a huge swath of information that's in them. They're probably sent to policymakers one-on-one, and they're used to inform some policy decisions and loading decisions and so on, but it's not used by the public. So we're basically saying that we're putting out all of this information that we're probably not putting out in a way that's consumable, not just to researchers and economists, but to a much wider audience. And this is kind of what most of the reports look like, which is great for policy wonks like me maybe, but maybe not for everybody else. So the atlas is kind of inspired by socializing World Bank's knowledge on international development through data visualization and storytelling. We've actually been doing the atlas for a long time. This is the oldest one I could find, and from 1966. And we basically have this funny looking map, and we have two estimates, population and per capita product. We didn't even call it GDP at the time. Then by 1983, we went into 3D maps, which, as you all know, is a big no-no these days. And then in 1985, we had maybe like 5-6 estimates. We even had life expectancy and infant mortality. So we actually started broadening our data provision to more social dimensions. The more recent one, since the adoption of the SDGs, which I will get into in a few minutes, we've been producing the Atlas of Sustainable Development Goals, which is focused on the 17 goals that are part of this framework. And we did one in 2018. The 2021 was the 2020 version was the first one that was all digital. Of course, since there was the pandemic, we couldn't really have digital physical copies. And that kind of forced us to think about how we can digitize our product entirely and do more interactive storytelling rather than sort of these very static graphics that reach people who can hold this report and reach this report. So just to circle back on what the SDGs are. There are 17 goals established by the United Nations and agreed upon by all its member states. And within these goals, there are like 230 indicators that are measured and reported on by all member states. And the idea behind it is to measure progress across eradicating poverty, ending hunger, measuring climate action, what's life on land, etc. So I'll get into a few examples of what the stories looked like and how we came up with some of the visualizations in the atlas. And the first one is about how many deaths were averted due to COVID-19 vaccinations. In this chart, each pie is a country. The red part of the pie shows the share of deaths caused due to COVID-19, and the green part of the pie shows the share of deaths averted due to COVID-19 vaccinations. So that we actually focused less on the total numbers and more on the ratio. So it was kind of a choice that we could have made. We could have focused on what those total numbers looked like, but what we really wanted to get at was, were there more deaths saved than deaths averted than deaths happened when there were vaccinations? And that kind of helped us look at all of these different countries irrespective of population. If we really looked at the overall numbers, some of the bigger countries would probably take up the whole page and you wouldn't be able to see most of the countries and really get to the information for each country. So we still have the total population numbers for deaths averted and deaths that occurred, but they are shaded by color. So the darker the pie, the more deaths occurred or averted, and lighter it is, the less it was. However, the size of the pies itself are more indicative of the ratio of that. About 109, not about, exactly 109 out of the 175 economies had more deaths averted because of vaccinations than they were caused due to COVID-19. So with the vaccinations coming in, that's the number of, even though there was such high number of deaths, we actually averted more than equal amount of it, if not. And these countries are shown in the top panel over there. And I will zoom into them in just a minute. I think you can see this now. Among these countries, the most extreme examples are India and US. Those are the two countries I've also lived in. In the US, there are 860,000 deaths due to COVID-19. This is a little dated now, so things have changed since then. While nearly 1.8 million lives were saved from vaccinations. Without vaccines, the number of deaths would have been close to 2.5 million, which is a summation of the two. So that's a pretty stark number. Another story I will get into is about climate change and gender. How are women and men impacted differently due to climate change events? And in this case, I will tell a story about it a little bit, but it's also about how we came up with the graphics. And in the first one, I kind of showed you how we decided between ratio versus total numbers. In this case, it's a little bit about showing how much women were impacted in situations of drought as opposed to men. So to give you some context, in about 1 out of 4 rural households in the world, there is no running water at home. So they have to go to water facilities and walk long distances, and many of them have to, travel between, in kilometers wise, a few kilometers each way to get water. Which means that in a week, the amount of time you actually have to spend doing this accumulates quite a bit. And this chart shows the amount of time spent by rural households in Uganda to fetch water. And it's divided, as you can see, by the number of hours, like 1 to 5, 6 to 10, and so on. The proportion is the share of households that fall into each of these few categories. And then the color shows whether it's men or whether it's women. So yellow is women and men is red, blue. Or if you perceive color differently, maybe purple. Now, this chart shows that during normal weather, women spend more time fetching water than men do, as you can see here. It's about 4 hours each week on average, and it's about 3.5 hours for men and boys. Actually, we'll do an age breakdown in just a bit, but that's kind of the overall trend. But when you look at this visualization in a drought condition, it's a very different story. I should have paused it maybe right about here. Let's see if I can pause it. Here, this is the drought situation. You can see that the graph now covers a lot more of the yellow part, which means that during drought conditions, most of the burden that is taken on is by women and girls. So they are spending more time that is needed to fetch water because of a drought situation. It's entirely on women and girls. What this does is not just that it has a health impact because you're walking long distances, you're carrying heavy stuff, but it also impacts how much time you have to do other activities. As girls, you probably want to go to school and you have to miss out. Or as women, you would like to do some income generating work, but you don't have the time to because these are the kinds of responsibilities that take up a lot of your time. We decided to go with this kind of a chart largely because it kind of gives you this picture of fluidity, so you can kind of perceive water, so it helps you connect a little bit with the topic itself. And it shows you, I think, in a pretty interesting way how much it can change over time. Another visualization that I would like to show you is about who is getting richer in the world. Now, in this case, this was on SDG 8, which is on economic growth and jobs. This is a pretty regular scatter plot, which shows growth in mean income on the y-axis and growth for bottom 40% income on the x-axis, which basically means that is the average income growing faster than the income growth for people who belong in the poorest quintiles of income, or is it the other way around? So if income grew faster for the poorest people, that means income inequality is reducing. And if income grew faster for the mean income than the poorest, then income inequality is increasing. And ideally, we want income inequality to reduce. And so we would want to see the dots be more towards the right bottom part, right? This chart, it helps a little bit to see it, but you can't fully visualize it largely because you kind of, X and Y axes tend to make you think of like cause and effect. But that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for what is the relationship between the two. And so we turn this chart around a little bit and highlight the portion that we care about. Then we look at Sub-Saharan Africa and we highlight that in yellow. And you can see that how many countries lie on the left side of the axis, whereas on the Y of the axis. So we annotated with slower growth for bottom 40% and faster growth for bottom 40%. And you can see about 10 out of the 15 countries for which we have data in Sub-Saharan Africa are on the left side of the chart, which means the income inequality in these countries is increasing. I'll skip the last one. It's kind of an interesting one because it's about who's getting killed. And it's, the ratio is very stark between men and women. But it's a teaser, so you can go and look at the atlas. But I will skip into what we did to produce something like this. It was a large and diverse team. We had authors who were usually experts in the field, data scientists or statisticians who work with this data. So for example, I work on gender statistics, so I wrote the chapter on SDG 5, which is on gender inequality. I also work on some other chapters that I'm not necessarily an expert on, and so I consult other people within the World Bank to help me understand what those trends look like. For example, undernourishment, and this time for SDG 2, which is on ending hunger. We talk a lot about how expensive food diets tend to be and how much of the proportion of an average person's income go into food prices and how it affects people who live below poverty line. And I don't know much about hunger, but we are lucky to have a lot of experts in different areas, and so we consult them in those spaces and get more information from them. And then we also work with visualization developers who do the visual development themselves, very sort of in line with media outlets that, we have that bifurcation. And then we have one designer for the atlas who kind of makes sure that all of the design is beautiful, but also in line with what we want to show across the whole atlas. There's 17 goals, 17 writers involved, more or less. So there, things could look very different if there wasn't one person kind of making sure it all looks the same. And then there's a few of us who are the editors as well. I'm one of the co-leads of the project, so me, one of my other co-leads, and two other people who are managers edit the chapters, make sure that they are not just correct and accurate, but also overall have the kind of information we want to show. And in this atlas, we were focusing a lot on interconnectedness between goals, like I showed on SDG 5, we talk about gender and climate change. In poverty as well, we talk about poverty and climate change. In health, we talk about, impact of COVID and health and so on. I would be remiss if I didn't have a visual about visuals from the atlas, so this is one on that. We basically had, ranging from 20 charts to 8 charts between each goal. We had the globe as a key visual because it's called the atlas, so we wanted to showcase that. We had a look-up country of interest, so you can look up your country and have that highlighted through the publication, so that kind of helped you connect with the country of your interest. And then we had a consistent style and components guide that we used across all of the atlas, kind of similar to news organizations again. Now, one of the key things that was important to us was that we make it into a global public good. And the few ways that we did that was we made sure there was anybody who could download the charts and you reuse it. They can also download the data and reuse it, reproduce it. And then there's code available on GitHub for all of the visualizations that we put together, not just for data transparency, but also for anybody who wants to be learning data visualizations can take a look at these and use them as examples and a way to learn. And lastly, in order for it to be really truly a global public good, we don't make it available in just English, we also translate it into Arabic, Spanish, and French, which hopefully reaches a much wider audience. Lastly, one of the other goals of the atlas was not just making sure that we deliver this information to a wide audience, but it's also to develop more transparency in process of our data, and so we make all of our code available for anybody to look at it, vet it, and so on. And to also give, sort of showcase the potential of development data. And those are sort of the two tenets of tenets, that is, potential in data and trust in data, that we like to develop within the bank's development data team. That's all from me. That was the SDG Atlas team. So from them and from me, thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. Thank you for presenting Atlas and for making the codes and data available. It's very impressive. Our last presenter is Lily Houtman, and she will be presenting the challenges and opportunities of designing use maps for mobile devices. Welcome.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Lily Houtman. My pronouns are they, them. I'm a PhD student at Penn State in the Department of Geography, and today I am presenting on the challenges and opportunities of designing news maps for mobile devices. I also have captions on, just for accessibility. You can do that in PowerPoint and Google Slides, and I highly recommend it. So I also wanted to give like a who am I, why am I as a cartographer presenting at a data journalism conference. So I did my undergrad at UW-Madison working with Rob Roth, and there we did a lot of work on kind of storytelling and data journalism in cartography, so I was kind of exposed to this in my undergrad, and then as a grad student I have now conducted a master's thesis, which is what I'm presenting today, and I am in my first year of my PhD, so I'm going to stay within the data journalism realm, and I'm at a really great time that if you have any suggestions for like how to better research this for my PhD, I'm very open to that because I'm still in the planning stages. I'm also an NSF GRFP fellow, so I've been funded for this research, which is also just something I wanted to share for any other students in the room, that like NSF is funding this kind of like data journalism research, and that's like really awesome to see. I don't know if that's the first thing you think of when you think of NSF, so I just wanted to suggest that other people apply for that as well. And then finally, I've been a member for about 4 years of NACIS, which is kind of the biggest cartography conference. I highly recommend anyone interested in data journalism check out that conference as well. We have a lot of like data journalists there, and that is also where I met a lot of the subjects for my interviews, which I'm about to present on. So broadly, my research is about maps on mobile devices, and it is specifically about thematic maps, which is kind of like a data map, basically. So it's not a reference map, it's like an election map, a COVID map, something like that, that tells you something more than just, the location of the world. And I am specifically situating my research within data journalism just because that is one of the most common ways that the public is encountering thematic maps. And so to frame my research and frame my questions, these are kind of the 6 main themes that I was thinking about when structuring my questions. So thinking about responsive design, screen constraints of a mobile device. Within cartography and map making, we're always thinking about generalization and complexity. I think that's something in general data viz as well, although there are going to be some things here that are a little more specific to maps. Something called post-WIMP environments, which is basically like a phone. WIMP stands for Windows Icon Mouse and Pointer, I think. I always forget what the M is. But it's basically, on a phone or an iPad or any other tablet, you have, you don't have a mouse. You can't hover over things. You have to click on things, and you can't have like a million windows like you can on a big desktop screen. And then I'm also thinking about accessibility from a technical and an individual perspective. So the way that I approached my research to understand mobile thematic map design was basically interviewing 18 news cartographers. Now, their official title was data journalist for the most part, so they are broadly data journalists. I just am specifically interviewing the people that are working on maps. And so I had an interview with them, about a 45-minute verbal interview, and then I also asked them to create an interface mock-up to envision the future of mobile map design. So I'm going to be sharing some of those as well, and that's what I have on the right side of the screen here. So I'm not really someone who likes to focus on the methods in a talk. I like to get right into the results. And if you're like a big methods person, you can ask me about them later. So one of the first things that I think was the biggest thing I was kind of curious about was, are people designing mobile first or desktop first in newsrooms? Because most guidelines, from cartography, from data viz, now are saying mobile first. But a lot of people really were trained in desktop first if they were trained, 5-10 years ago. And so the designers, the cartographers, these days are split. Some design mobile first, some design desktop first, but a lot of them are honestly designing in parallel, which is something that I'm kind of referring to as simultaneous design. So if any of you have used the tool AI to HTML, which stands for Adobe Illustrator to HTML, not artificial intelligence, that is something that a lot of people are using so they can think about mobile and desktop at the same time, and they don't have to prioritize one over the other. And part of the reason for this, part of the reason that people are not just designing mobile first is because they got into cartography to design big, beautiful maps. They don't want to, design something just for a teeny phone screen, because there's like so many cool things you can do. That being said, I think this is a really cool example of showing how like a phone screen can still have a really beautiful map. So this is a map by Lauren Tierney of the Washington Post. And she basically took the Appalachian Trail for this. We're just going through the Appalachian Trail. And on mobile, you just focus in on the trail because it's very long, very skinny. But on desktop, you just have all this other information on the side. So you can still tell a really beautiful map-based story that works for desktop and mobile. You don't have to pick one over the other. And nothing is lost for mobile. And so in thinking about maps specifically, responsive design is kind of an interesting thing because for a lot of other types of data viz, you can kind of twist around elements. You can play with the space of it to make something that might be landscape on desktop into portrait for mobile. But this is a lot harder for maps because there is an inherent geography to maps. So sometimes in academia, people are theorizing like, oh, is there like this cool like new thing that we can do to kind of make maps easier to visualize on a phone? I'm not sure if this works the best. It does make everything equal across countries, but it also makes the thing that you're actually seeing much, much smaller. And so I'm finding in my interviews that news cartographers, for the most part, aren't really interested in trying those like new things. They're mostly trying to use established map types and just change them for mobile in a way that works, and we're going to explore some of those. But sometimes certain subjects can popularize a certain map type. So a cartogram is something that we see often in election mapping. And so it goes away from, the geography a little bit, but it's still mostly there. And so this is a map type that wasn't really used a ton. It was, used a little bit, but elections, especially in the US, have kind of popularized it to use it a little bit more. This one's not the best for mobile, but just an example of how we can continue to change. And so one thing that really came up is that there's not a lot of official standards in newsrooms about like, here's your prescriptive design guideline of how you are exactly going to design every single map. Because that's really difficult, and these people are experts. They've been working on this forever, and so they kind of have an intuition about when to make certain choices. So some things that we might see in particular with the US, because that is, again, something that is horizontal, goes across your entire screen on a desktop, doesn't work as well on mobile, is like, are you rotating the map? Are you splitting the map? Using multiple, switching to a chart? So some people have successfully, at least in my opinion, rotated a map. Now this is something that you have to balance, like user discomfort. Are they going to like this? I don't know. However, this was a particular story. So this map is by Hannah Dormito at the Washington Post. And this is about abortion in the US. And so once Roe versus Wade was overturned, there was a clinic in North Dakota that actually moved to Minnesota. And so if she would have split the country down the middle and not rotated it, but kind of stacked one on top of the other, that wouldn't have worked very well because that essential data point is at that split. So here she chose to rotate it. Again, this is something where it's a case-by-case basis. You can't prescribe this for every single map. And then I wanted to get into interactivity as well, because I think this is something that, you know, a lot of us who are in this field, we really love interactive maps. They seem really cool. There's a lot of cool things you can do, but are users actually interacting with them? And what I'm finding, at least in my interview, is that a lot of people are reducing the amount of interaction that they use in maps, in other data viz, specifically in journalism, because readers are increasingly, you know, reading on phones. They have a million distractions on their phone. You have to really get them to pay attention to the story. And so if they are not invested in the story, they are going to hop out of it, go to something else. So overall, I am seeing that reduction, but I do want to share kind of two main exceptions. So the first, the word I'm going to use for this, we in cartography say scrolly telling. I don't know if anyone else really uses that, but that's kind of what my field has come across. And so what these types of stories are, and I'm sure you've seen these types of stories, you get to just scroll through like it's a news story that you would read. So you're not seeing all this at once, right? You're seeing like maybe a fourth of that. And new information is revealed as you scroll. And so things might pop up on the maps. You know, there might be a map background for the whole thing. And basically, like, you get interactivity to some extent because, like, scrolling is an interaction. It's just a very simple one as opposed to, like, tapping on a little node in every single part of the map. And the other one that people do really like is egocentric maps. So if they can learn something about themselves, type in their city, you know, their grandma's city, whatever it is, they are much more happy to interact with those types of maps than any other types of maps. That being said, like, there are some other things people are trying. So this one, a few people did actually mention Tinder as inspiration. So what you would do is you would show a third of this at a time and then swipe through the map to see the different sections of the map. And now, when I'm talking about data journalism, and I'm sure a lot of you know this, there are a lot of constraints that maybe people making maps for other places don't have to think about as much because users are on the move. So they might be reading outside where it's really bright. They're going to be distracted by other things. And they might be, you know, reading on the subway or something and have a really bad internet connection. So you do have to design for attention and those constraints. And then the other thing is, like, in a newsroom, of course, there is a very tight timeline. There is, you know, breaking news, you have to get the story out. And additionally, there's not a lot of opportunity for user testing in a newsroom, at least according to my participants on their teams. And so you can't always, in the newsroom, figure out what to improve. So this is, you know, something that I, as an academic, want to acknowledge as constraints, so that way maybe those of us who have more time and freedom for testing can work on this. However, what is kind of exciting is thinking about the future. So at the moment, probably about a third of my participants in their mock-ups that I had them draw used a very similar template to what they use today. And they basically said, like, you know, I would love to envision a very different future, but that's very hard to do given all the constraints that I have in the newsroom. However, I do want to share what most participants did, which is things that are a little bit more exciting, things they would love to do if they had the time and freedom, and so I hope they will get the time to do some of these. So yeah, sorry, this is the example of kind of like your standard news story. You know, you get a few maps here and there, but it's kind of what users are used to seeing. It's not something super novel. So this was something that I think is probably the most out there of what my participants drew, which is being to actually feel the heat through your phone. So to tell a story about climate change, you would tap on one of the little dots, and then your phone would like emit whatever temperature that is. So it's going to be like really hot here, but not as hot there. That is probably a little bit more out there, but still cool, obviously, to think about. This one I showed a little preview at the beginning. I really like this one. So this is kind of using some physical materials. What this person suggested is for a wildfire, why don't you take a real napkin, carve it into the shape of California, and then burn little dots where actual wildfires have occurred with like a little match or something. Obviously, that is going to take longer than just making it on a computer. However, it might, evoke an emotional response. And then finally, this one unfortunately is a little blurry. But basically, this person was considering taking each of the states out of the map and then ranking them on some sort of scrolling chart to kind of have the most affected states at the top and the least affected at the bottom. I think this was in the context of sea level rise. And so then you get to scroll through the states, which allows each of them to be a little bigger if you want, rather than just seeing them all in the country. And of course that's going to work nicer for mobile when we have this big horizontal US. So in conclusion, what I am really looking forward to doing in my PhD is starting to think about the user side. I've had this kind of preliminary study as my master's thesis to see what journalists think, see what journalists need, what they don't have the space for in their newsrooms, and what they're excited about. And so I am very much hoping to continue to research this, especially from the user perspective, in my PhD, and I'm also very open to hearing anything else that interests the rest of you. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lily, for sharing your perspectives from academia. Very insightful. We have around 10 minutes for the Q&A session, so I'm now going to invite all the presenters back to the stage.
That was super interesting. I wonder if you've seen examples of places using AR or the phone's gyroscope to look into that. And I actually personally would hate this, being forced to rotate my phone. But have you seen any of those options?
Yeah, I think that's something that people are interested in a little bit. I got a few mentions here and there. However, I think the biggest thing, at least from the journalists, from what I'm seeing, is that you would want it to work on a desktop as well, because you do have a large number of users who are still reading on a desktop, and so you'd have to make that experience somehow work for both. I've seen, somewhat on that line of things, people using drones to go out and capture footage, and then you just play it as a video in the background, and that's something that I think works a little better for both desktop and mobile, because you, at least in this field, have to think about both.
Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
This is a question for you. In your work, have you developed any best practices for what kinds of what goes into a graph or visual chart such that it's more likely to get someone to engage with that visual? What goes into an interesting visual, and what are some methods of knowledge that you learn?
Thank you. I guess one of the biggest struggles we have, is among the research audience or the economist crowd, is to select information specifically for visualizations. There's a tendency to put everything they have out there because that's their way of saying, this is us showing, being transparent and giving the audience the ability to infer whatever they want to infer from it. But often the goal of communication or data visualization is different, which is you have to be selective in what message you want to show and not dump everything out there for the audiences, because it's not very easy to communicate that information. So I think one of the main practices that I've had to sort of work on with colleagues in my team is try to break down what their data says and have a separate chart for every message that they have, and then choose which one is important enough for them to disseminate out there. And that usually, rather than sort of focusing on what kind of chart type to use, is usually focused on limiting the amount of information they show per country, or maybe they don't need to show global data, they just need to show a regional data, or they need to show only some time periods rather than the whole time period. So it's a little bit of a data selection process that has to be refined. And then of course, once you've got to that point, then we can have some guidelines on data visualizations, but that's sort of more interactive and fun, so they're more likely to do that part. It's the first part that's the biggest challenge, and so that's one of the biggest advice I think we find useful passing on to sort of the more research community from a policy background.
Okay, we can take one last question. Any question for Lori by any chance? Oh, I have one question for Lori. So you mentioned the sample size is one of the limitations, right?
Yes.
So what would you do to generalize your findings in the future?
To generalize the findings, like my first reflex is to generalize the findings. My first reflex would be to try to get a wider panel or participants, probably a bigger diversity, because we were recruiting in one city within range of a short range of our lab. So I would say contacting people in medias in other places. So that's my first reflex. And yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's thank again for all the great presentations. And thank you for joining us. I believe this is the last panel, so I hope you all enjoyed C+J and have a safe trip back home. Thank you.
Thank you.